Laki's battle with the dark forces. Laki's battle with the dark forces, the beginning. During World War II, Laki served as a tank operator and fought against the Nazis in France. One day, he fell into an ambush and was severely wounded, unable to continue his service. His dreams were shattered. One evening, a colonel approached him in the hospital and asked if Laki wanted to continue serving. But there were conditions. Laki agreed, and the colonel took him along. During their drive to the new service location, there was a deadly silence in the car. When they arrived, Laki realized they had reached some kind of secret military camp. In the colonel's office, the colonel asked once more if Laki was truly ready for anything. Laki replied yes. A priest entered the room and Laki was flooded with questions, but the colonel promised to explain later. Laki followed the priest. They entered a room where a chair stood in the center, and the entire room was covered in pentagrams. The priest seated Laki and told him that he would have to fight dark forces, so they had to summon an assistant. The priest began the summoning ritual. When it was finished, it seemed like nothing had worked, but suddenly a small boy appeared in the room holding a contract. The boy said that if Laki signed the contract, he would receive 13 marks on his shoulder, and each time the assistant helped, he would take 1 mark. The contract was this: if Laki did not use up all the marks by the end of the war, the contract would be void. But if all the marks were used after death, his soul would go to hell from where the assistant had come. Laki spent several days studying the contract and eventually agreed. As soon as he did, 13 marks appeared on his shoulder, and all his ailments vanished. From that day, Laki began his training. The priest gave him a blessed silver dagger and a pistol. The assistant eagerly awaited the moment when he could reclaim all the marks and take Laki's soul. He lived in the same room as Laki. One evening, Laki joked about the assistant calling him a low-ranking demon. The assistant replied that he commanded 39 divisions of Hell's army. Laki didn't believe him, as he believed in neither God nor demons. But he couldn't understand how he had fully recovered. His epilepsy and wounds were completely healed. The assistant was always by Laki's side wherever he went. Laki trained hard and studied until one day, a sergeant rushed in to announce that the colonel urgently summoned him. Kai and the assistant quickly went to the colonel, who informed them that it was time to begin the mission, and that the assistant would accompany Laki to help when needed. Laki's battle with dark forces, first encounter. Laki's morning began like the past 2 weeks living at the camp. He brewed some coffee while his helper, Sani, lay quietly by the stove. Laki had given him that name to avoid awkward questions from others about why he called the boy the helper, and not by a proper name. While sipping his coffee, Laki wondered how the day would unfold. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Opening it, Laki saw a sergeant, who informed him that the colonel was waiting for him. Laki quickly dressed and hurried to the colonel's office. Upon entering, he noticed the colonel sitting with a thoughtful expression, staring at papers in his hands. The colonel raised his eyes and told Laki that his rank had been promoted to captain. He handed him a badge with the inscription Secret Intelligence Unit 13, shortened to SU-13, and reported that a column heading to the battlefield had been attacked, and Laki had to investigate. Laki reminded the colonel that his task was to fight dark forces, to which the colonel replied that the ambush was very unusual, which is why Laki was being sent. After the conversation with the colonel, Laki hurried home to gather his things and headed to the incident site. Sani sat silently in the back, while Laki observed the devastated villages left behind by the retreating Nazis who had killed people and destroyed homes. Absorbed in the sights, Laki didn't realize when they reached their destination. The car stopped and a major approached. The major looked disturbed. Laki showed his badge and introduced himself. The major told him he had arrived just in time and that help was definitely needed. Laki noticed the bloody spots on the snow-covered road leading to the vehicles, though the bodies were still out of sight. As Laki was about to move toward the trucks, Sani got out of the car and hurried after him. The major, surprised by the child's presence, asked what the boy was doing here. Laki explained that the boy had been taken in by a village, and since then, he never left Laki's side. The major, still astonished, commented on the strangeness of taking a child into such dangerous situations. When they reached the trucks, Laki glanced into the cargo bed and saw a gruesome scene: soldiers torn to pieces, body parts scattered, and shell casings littering the area. It was clear the soldiers had fought back, but no sign of the attackers was visible. Laki asked the major if anyone had touched the bodies, to which the major replied no, as he knew how to handle such situations. Sani nodded, and Laki approached him. Sani whispered that this was not the work of animals and that he would go check for tracks unnoticed. Laki told the major to stay by the vehicles while they went to search for tracks to figure out who attacked them. The major, surprised, responded that it was snowing and the tracks would be covered. So Laki replied that his grandfather was an excellent hunter and taught him how to track in the snow. Laki and Sani distanced themselves from the convoy. Sani touched the snow with his small hand, and as soon as fingers made contact, his eyes turned fiery red with a flame in the center. Even Laki was startled. After a few moments, Sani declared that it was the work of a spirit who had been dead for 2 weeks. Laki asked the major if there was a village nearby, to which the major replied that there was, but it was almost deserted. Laki then inquired if there had been a resistance movement against the Nazis in that village. The major confirmed that there had been, but the Nazis had caught and killed them all, treating one family particularly cruelly by hanging them in front of the village as an example. Laki then instructed the major to have his men collect the bodies and return to the unit while he and a few soldiers would remain to assist Laki. The major followed his orders. Laki, along with the others, rushed to the village. As they approached, Laki saw the tree by the road leading into the village, where 5 ropes still hung from the branches, remnants of the hanged family. They stopped by the tree, and Laki noticed that 4 of the ropes had been cut, but one appeared to have been ripped, which seemed strange to Laki. However, he simply said they should move into the village and talk to the locals about the family. The major immediately asked what this had to do with the ambush, but Laki didn't answer. Upon entering the village, they found a house where some of the remaining villagers lived and knocked on the door. An elderly man opened and invited them inside, but Laki declined and asked if they had buried the family that the Nazis hanged. The old man explained that only elderly people were left in the village and they didn't have the strength to dig graves in the frozen ground, so the bodies were being kept in a cold storage shed until the ground thawed. So Laki then asked if they could inspect the bodies, to which the old man agreed and led them to the shed. Upon entering, they saw 4 bodies, the mother and 3 children. Laki immediately asked where the 5th body was, as there had been 5 ropes on the tree, but only 4 corpses. The old man replied that perhaps the Germans had taken it, as when they came to remove the bodies, they found only 4. Laki now understood who was responsible for killing the soldiers. He suggested they all go back inside to warm up and talk. Once inside, Laki asked the old man if they had any animal bones, to which the old man replied that there hadn't been any animals left in the village for a long time, because the Germans had taken them all. Then Laki asked if there were any bones buried somewhere from long ago, and the old man confirmed there were and told them where they were buried. Laki ordered the soldiers to go dig up the bones, and the major immediately questioned how the bones were connected to the investigation. The major declared he would head back to the unit because he didn't want to deal with any nonsense, but Laki warned him that if he left, he would be court-martialed for disobeying a direct order. The major fell silent and sat by the stove. When the soldiers returned with the bones, Laki began making crosses out of them and hung them by every window, leaving one to hang above the door. The sergeant offered to hang the last cross above the door and placed a chair nearby to reach it. Near midnight, the room suddenly grew cold, though the fire was still burning in the stove. Then, they heard footsteps outside, along with tapping on the walls and windows. The noises grew louder and closer until, suddenly, the door swung open, and the hanged man who had disappeared from the tree entered the house. He reeked of death, his belly swollen from devouring the soldiers. Everyone readied their weapons about to fire, when the major shouted not to shoot and ordered the sergeant to hang the cross above the door. The sergeant quickly climbed onto the chair but slipped and fell. At that moment, Laki pulled out the holy dagger and rushed at the undead man before he could attack anyone, but the corpse flung Laki across the room. Laki shouted to Sani to do something. Sani's eyes turned red, and he began transforming into his true form, growing several times larger. His skin turned black, his head morphed into a monstrous face with rows of sharp teeth, and his large red eyes flared. Sani attacked the undead man. Dark tendrils emerged from the demon, wrapping around the undead figure, but the corpse was so strong it tore the tendrils apart and tried to escape through the door. Suddenly, the sergeant shouted that the cross was hung, and as the undead man approached him, he began shooting. When the corpse had thrown Laki, it broke several of his ribs, but Laki ignored the pain. He jumped up, ran to the undead man, and stabbed him in the stomach with the holy dagger. The blade sank into the creature's flesh like butter. Laki twisted the knife and sliced down, opening the belly. Black, foul-smelling liquid poured out, and the corpse collapsed to the floor, no longer moving. Laki realized he had killed the monster, and it would no longer harm the living. He ordered the soldiers to carry the body to the shed with the rest of the family. Meanwhile, Sonny returned to his small boy form. Suddenly, Laki felt a burning sensation on his shoulder. He realized that the helper had taken one of the marks for his assistance. The captain then instructed everyone to sign confidentiality agreements about what had happened, warning that anyone who spread the story or refused to sign would be executed. After signing, the major asked what had just happened. Laki explained that when the family was hanged, the father cursed the Germans. Afterward, he rose from the dead, driven by hatred for the living, and began killing people, starting with the convoy. But now the spirit had been sent to hell. Laki then looked at his shoulder and saw that he now had 12 marks instead of 13. He also realized that his ribs no longer hurt. He glanced at Sanny, who quietly replied that he had healed Laki. They said their goodbyes, got into the car, and drove back to the camp to report to the colonel that everything was resolved. The major promised to return with more soldiers to bury the family now, rather than waiting for spring.